Good morning, everybody. Elizabeth here. Welcome to this workshop. We'll just be waiting for a couple more minutes and then we'll ask Prof. Thad to kindly start. Thank you.
Whoa! Don't we need a warrant? We're just looking for a name or an address.
Hello again, everybody, and once again, welcome. And welcome especially to Prof. Thad. We're really grateful that he's making time for us. So Thad, over to you, please. Thanks.
Hi, Elizabeth. Nice to see you, and hello to everyone. Let me see whether I can share my screen. Okay, you should see the first slide of the presentation. And so I will speak to it unless I'm told otherwise. Here's a bit of my background on the topic of citations. There's my count according to Google Scholar, and there's my H index, and I will tell you a bit about Google Scholar and H indices later in the presentation. The NRF has been happy with my citations and the influence of my research, and then I was on the Senate Executive Committee at UJ I was elected 3 times, so I think that added up to 9 years. And so I'm familiar with UJ's promotion processes and how citations get figured in. I've done a bit of research on research. It's not my area of expertise. I'm a philosopher. But I have read studies about citations and other ways of making research, getting research to have an impact. And I've also spoken to colleagues who are highly cited about what they do to market their stuff. So let's move on to the actual presentation. You can feel free to ask questions anytime, but I don't think this talk will take more than 45 or 50 minutes. And so I do expect there will be time for questions at the end as well. And you need not take notes. I believe this is being recorded, and plus I'm happy to share these slides with those who are present. We will go through the first 3 of these 4 topics. I'm going to first discuss why you might be interested reasonably in getting your work cited. Then we'll go through some basics about citations, defining what they are, how they're calculated, and the like. And then I've got 34 different tips about how to increase citations of your research. You naturally won't take up all of them, but if you were to take up 4 or 5, I think it would presumably make some difference. At the end of the presentation, which I won't go through, are ways of increasing your chance of getting your work reprinted. And the more places your work appears, of course, the more likely it is to get cited. So first, why might you be interested in getting your work cited? One reason might be that you're interested in getting a rating from the NRF. The NRF, when it's evaluating applications, it wants to see whether scholars have mastered a niche, a particular field or subfield. And then they also consider how much recognition you've obtained in that field or subfield. And part of what recognition involves for the NRF is determined by citations. This didn't used to be the case, but now the NRF does require you to indicate your H-index on your rating application. And again, H-index is a certain way of calculating people's citations, which we'll talk about below. One reason you might want an NRF rating is the money that comes with it. A minimum of 30,000 Rand will come if you get any rating at all. So there's some financial incentive beyond whatever else having an NRF rating can do for you. Second reason to care about citations is your place at UJ, particularly at associate and full professor level. I can tell you that the Senate Executive Committee, which has to screen these applications and approve them, does look at citations. And you will, I presume the application form hasn't changed from a year ago when I was at UJ. 5.12 listed the following: that a Scopus report or similar relevant metric should be provided as an attachment. That will allow you to submit a Google Scholar report if you choose instead of the Scopus report. And I'm going to give you some advice to suggest that you should indeed submit the Google Scholar report instead. And that's coming up on slides 16 and 17, I think. And then there's you. Most of us, if we write something and we go to the trouble of publishing it, we want people to then read it. And then we want them not merely to read it, but we want them to engage with it in some way or find it useful to mention in their own work. And so we've got our own interest as scholars in getting our work cited. And if you're an emerging researcher, it's a bit of a daunting point. I mean, it's hard enough to have finished the PhD, and it's hard enough to then learn how to publish. But there's yet another hurdle to overcome as a scholar, and that's being proactive about getting people to read and discuss your work. I do think it helps to take steps to go out of your way to make people aware of what you've published. And I encounter colleagues regularly in South Africa. I've lived here 20 years, since 1999. And I often do encounter colleagues who find it somewhat distasteful to go out of their way to make others aware of what they've published. And I urge those colleagues to reflect on that. Presumably, colleagues think there's something revealing, important about their research. They think they've made a discovery. They have something to teach other experts. And those are all good reasons for making people aware of what you've published. And I believe that can be done in a way that isn't whatever brash or smacks of self-importance or comes off as self-interested. I don't think any of the advice I'm going to give you today has that kind of flavor to it. So those are reasons to care about citations. And now I'm in the second part of the presentation about giving you basics about citations. And first, we just need to define what a citation is. And that's your work having been included in the reference list of an academic publication. Normally, that's a book, a chapter in a book, a conference proceeding, or an article, something with an ISBN or an ISSN. That's a citation. So it doesn't matter how your work is cited, as it were. So it doesn't matter whether it's a quotation from your work, whether it's a full-length critical discussion, whether it's just a parenthetical mention of your name and date. All of those equally count as a citation. And it also doesn't matter who has cited your work. If it's a postgrad or a senior scholar, it doesn't matter. Again, they all equally count as a citation. I'm going to suggest later that these other elements of where the citation took place, or why the citation was made and who made it, I do think that matters if you are applying for promotion, for example. But just insofar as we're talking about what a citation is, these things don't matter. A citation is merely the fact of one of your works being included in a reference list. We are talking about citations today, but I think it's important not to get overly focused on them, and to keep in mind an array of other respects in which your work could have some scholarly impact. And UJ will ask you about citations, and UJ might not ask you about these other things, but my own view is that if you're applying for promotion, you should feel free to mention them. They matter, or they should matter, to an audience considering the extent to which your publications have been recognized. And so here's a nice long list of things to consider in addition to citations. If you're applying for promotion, for example, you can consider high impact factors, which are the citation rates not of your work, but of the journals in which you've published. We'll discuss that below. Critical discussions, reviews, quotations, mentions by high-profile scholars, mentions in prestigious venues, uses in classrooms, reprints, proceedings of a reputable conference, reputable presses in which that have put out books in which you've published, reputable databases that have accredited the journals in which you've published, journal rankings, competitive rejection rates, if you've published in good company, the placement of your work, for example, if yours is the lead chapter in a book, invitations you've received to contribute scholarship, if you've been included in special issues, mentioned in NGO reports, and you can also refer to social media engagements. So all of that are additional ways in which a publication can influence the field or an audience. And I think you should keep them in mind beyond citations when thinking about promoting or just even getting your work recognized. Furthermore, I think it's worth mentioning briefly that we might not even care too much about making a scholarly impact. Some of us have different aims with our scholarship. Some of us want to influence law or public policy. And in particular, I know my colleagues in law are often more concerned to be cited by the Constitutional Court, for example, than by other academic lawyers. So that's perfectly fine. If that's what matters to you in respect of your research, then I would highlight that in your promotions for application and point out what you've done to make changes in law or policy. However, back to citations. A citation, I've said, is a publication of yours or a work of yours being listed in an academic reference list. An impact factor is different. It's the average extent to which articles in a certain journal have been cited over a time period. And impact factors are relevant to UJ and the NRF, and that is particularly true in the natural or the hard sciences. That is not true in my field of philosophy. We just don't pay attention to them. And in fact, there's almost an inverse correlation between impact factor and quality of journal in my field. So this isn't going to, you need to figure out whether impact factors matter in your field if you don't already know. But even if they do matter, in a way, citations matter more because citations are about your publications, your work. Impact factors are instead about the journals in which you may have published. And one thing we know about impact factors, the research shows, is that when a journal has a very high impact factor, often it's due to a select minority of articles that appeared in that journal. It's not, it doesn't average out across all the publications in it. If you are interested in impact factors of the journals in which you've published, there are some online databases. The most commonly used one is Simago Junior, which gives you the number of citations to a journal over time, I think divided by the number of papers in it, if I remember. And that is for free. But you can also access Scopus, which will give you SNP, source normalized impact per paper, which factors in how many citations are normal for a particular field. I believe the Scopus database you have to pay for. UJ does have access to it, but you've got to get the library or Dale Towert, whose details I'll give you just now, to get in to access it for you. Here are two ways to calculate not impact factors, but citations to your specific work. One thing you can do is just look at the total number. A standard way to measure citations is simply to sum up how many you have, either over your career as a whole, or over the past 5 years, or if you're applying for an NRF rating, over the past 8 years. That's the window the NRF is interested in. Another way to calculate citations, though, is to compare your number of citations to the average in your specific field. That is known as the FWCI, the Field Weighted Citation Impact, and that is from Scopus. And if you do get that calculation from Mr. Towert or somebody in the library, then a score of 1 indicates that you are dead average relative to your field. And anything above 1 indicates that you're doing better than average, where a 2 signifies that you're doing 2 times better than the average in your field in terms of citations on a particular publication. There is, however, a third way to calculate citations, and that is the very influential H-index, which is defined as the highest number of publications H, with at least H number of citations each. So, for example, if you have an H-index of 5, that means you have, at most, 5 publications with at least 5 citations each. You don't have 6 publications that each have at least 6 publications. And I think a useful way to get a handle on what an H-index measures is to think of what it leaves out, the kind of information it excludes. So hypothetically, let's suppose you've got 2 papers published, and let's suppose that each paper has 100 citations each. What is your H-index going to be? Well, it's going to be 2, because you've got at most 2 papers with at least 2 citations each. And so the H-index excludes the fact that you've got 200 citations. Your H-index would be only 2 because you've got only 2 papers. But conversely now, suppose you have 100 publications, but each publication has only 2 citations. What will your H-index be? It will again be only 2. Yes, you have 100 papers, but the highest number of citations you got is 2 for a given paper. So again, you've got an H-index of 2 because you've got a maximum of 2 papers with at least the same number, 2 citations each. So the H-index not merely excludes the overall number of citations, it also excludes the number of publications you've got. And so, I mean, there are other problems with the H-index, but those are 2 that are worth mentioning. The other issue with the H-index is that it clearly favors people who've been around 20, 30, 40 years. It takes time to publish lots of papers that have been cited a lot. And so there have been various changes suggested to the H-index. I think the M-index is one where we divide the H-index by how old you are, how active you've been in the profession, something like that. But these things move slowly. It's still the H-index that is standard, and we've got to play the game and consider it when we are applying for ratings and promotions and grants and the like. Okay, so we've talked about what a citation is and different ways of calculating citations. Now we want to discuss how to learn of your particular citations. 2 main sources that are of interest to you at UJ in particular The first one is Google Scholar, which will list your publications. It'll give you a total citation count. It will give you an H-index. And it covers quite an array of different academic publications. Furthermore, you can click on the various citations and see who cited your work and precisely where, which is really, I mean, that's enormously useful. Scopus is another way to learn of your citation count, but it is restricted to Scopus accredited publications. But of those, it will give you a total citation count. It will also give you the field-weighted citation index for your publications, and also an H-index. And UJ will focus on the above two when it comes to promotion, but there is a third one out there that's available from the world of science. There's also one, frankly, on ResearchGate, but the ResearchGate and the world of science just aren't used institutionally by UJ. How can you get a hold of these indices? The Google Scholar one is easy. Just set up a Google account, create a Google Scholar page from within the account, and voila. It takes 5 minutes, not even. If you want a Scopus profile of your citations, that is tricky, and you need to go running to Mr. Dale Towert. There is his email address. Yes, it's his job, as I say. Don't feel shy for asking for a Scopus profile. Which one should you use? Well, if you want a calculation of your total citations and your H-index that are the highest, then you should definitely use the Google Scholar report. Why? Well, Google Scholar scans all the Scopus texts, but not vice versa, right? There are lots of non-Scopus texts that Scopus doesn't capture. And so that in itself is a clear reason why everybody's Google Scholar reports provide higher scores than Scopus reports. Google Scholar is fairly generous about what counts as a source. Sometimes it will include doctorates and book reviews, and we can have debates about whether that's appropriate. And in addition, the Google Scholar report will include self-citations, times you've cited yourself. And again, there's debate about whether that's appropriate to include that in a citation count. However, I'm here to tell you that CENEX doesn't care. I never once in my time on the Senate Executive Committee heard anyone raise the issue of a person's citation count having included self-citations. It just doesn't come up. And so, it's in your strategic interest to include them and hence to submit the Google Scholar report. That said, if your Scopus citations are high, and that is probably going to mean that you are working in one of the hard or natural sciences, then you should sort of tout that fact. You should play it up because UJ still cares particularly about Scopus accredited publications. That really matters a lot when UJ plays the ranking games. Notice that neither index, neither the Scopus nor the Google, will capture citations in things that aren't computerized. So books that haven't been digitized, any citations in those sources, they won't be captured. And so if you've been cited in important books, you're going to, I would point that out as part of my application for promotion, for example. The reports may or may not be accurate. And in particular, I noticed that often Google Scholar will make mistakes and ascribe works to scholars that just aren't theirs. They aren't the author, but maybe they were mentioned in the book, or maybe they edited the book, something like that. Mistakes happen. You can modify the Google Scholar list easily. You just need to log in, and it's quite straightforward to tick the box and remove the publications that aren't yours. In addition, if Google Scholar has missed some publications of yours, you can add them in. And so that's nice, quite a gift. It's difficult to modify the Scopus list. If there are errors in it, then go running to Mr. Towert. I invariably get the question, how many citations is good enough or decent or what have you? And I'm sorry, there's no clear answer to that. It varies from field to field. In general, in the STEM fields, citations are higher than they are, particularly in the humanities. For example, history or religion. I mean, it really varies quite a lot. What I can say from my perspective of having sat on Senex is that if we encountered an application for a full professor and we saw less than 50 citations or we saw an H-index under 5, that was, it stood out as something to discuss. I don't recall anybody having been held back simply because of that. I don't remember that at all, but it gave us pause to consider the profile, the research profile of the application. First one I just said. Do think it's the case, though, that if you've got a high number of citations, it makes promotion easier insofar as research is a part of that. I do think if you want to move institutions, that the more citations you can refer to on your CV, the easier it would be, at least again in terms of research. And then again, I reiterate this advice at the bottom of slide 21. UJ is going to ask you about your H-index and the number of citations you have, but you should feel free to change the conversation and talk about what we might call quality issues. So, who has cited your work? Where was it cited? How was it cited? For what purpose? If you can talk to those things, if they work in your favor, then bring them up and mention them somewhere in your application. All right, last slide about basics of citations before I give you the concrete nuts and bolts advice about how to increase yours. Don't presume that publishing in an accredited journal is enough for your article to be cited. That's just not true. If a journal is accredited, that means it's got a decent peer review system, but that's all it means. It's not any indication of how often the journal is read. Or how wide the audience is. In addition, if you publish in a high impact factor journal, that doesn't necessarily mean that your particular article is going to get cited a lot. If the journal has a high impact factor, that means that on average, articles in that journal get cited a lot, but there's no telling whether you're going to be part of that. You can't presume that potential readers will find you on the web, even though you've published on a particular topic and the title of your paper is clear. There's just such a massive stuff out there. I often find papers that have been published where I thought, geez, I published something on that and I don't see my cited. And that's just normal. I can't really blame them. There's just too much to wade through. Don't presume that if you're going to get cited, it's going to happen soon. Again, it depends on the field. In my field, it can take years, even decades, for citations to add up. Don't presume that citation rate will track the quality of your work by any means. I mean, in some ways, getting cited is a matter of a popularity contest. And what's popular doesn't, necessarily track what's of quality. And I have, I think some of my own best work is just not cited much at all. And that's a disappointing fact about the academic field. Also, don't presume that if one of your publications never gets cited, that you're doomed. It really can be luck of the draw. So keep at it. All right. 34 tips for increasing citations now. Approach these tips cafeteria style. Pick what looks good to you. Try things out. Presumably you're not going to do all 34, but again, if you do 5 or 6, it might well do you some good. So the first tip I've got is to think of your audience and try to write to a large one. In my field, I'm a philosopher, there are maybe 100, 120 philosophers in South Africa. And there are more than that in London or, Boston. So if I want a high number of citations, or I otherwise want a large number of people reading my work, I'm not going to address merely my colleagues in South Africa. I'm going to think of how my work might be of interest to those in this country, but also beyond it. And so I urge you to do the same. If you're doing a South African focused study, think about how you might present it in a way that would be of interest to those on the rest of the continent or in the global South or in the developing world, so to speak, or international scholars generally. Tip number 2, think about what many would find useful. You will often find that summarizing work or overviews of fields get cited quite highly. And that's because they're particularly useful. You don't have to do a whole heck of a lot of work in order to have a nice understanding of what's going on in a field if somebody has given you a big picture. So there are different headings, phrases that are used to mark these kinds of contributions, depending on your field. Sometimes it's recent work in X, or a review of literature on Y, or a meta-analysis or meta-study of studies. Third suggestion is to catch the scoop. If there's something that is on the horizon, something is going on in society that's fresh, if you can jump on it and get there first, or amongst the first, that can increase your readership, not merely of your work on that topic, but also your other previous publications. And I have a colleague who, in particular, when the Americana tragedy was unfolding, he really got in there and wrote some important work on Americana, and has told me that it's not merely that work that has found an audience, but his other publications as well, and probably as a result. Fourth tip is to be thorough. I have read studies suggesting that a paper is more likely to be cited the longer the reference list is and the more revisions it's undergone. And that gives us hope to those of us whose work has been rejected many times. And that still happens to me, by the way. I have papers rejected 5, 10 times, is not unusual before they eventually find a home. And I take comfort in knowing that they're probably better papers for having undergone the revisions. At least, that's some, at least the science suggests that that's, if they're not better, at least somebody reading them thinks they're better, is at least what's suggested by the studies. Fifth tip is to indeed publish in English. It is the academic lingua franca, for better or worse. I'm not suggesting you publish only in English, but the reality is that most academics around the world, of any language they use, English is the dominant one. But number 6 is also the case. If you've published in English, if you get a publication translated into another language, that can only help with citations. You've got a broader readership then, English plus another language or two. Aim to get work reprinted is the 7th tip. The more places a publication appears, the more likely it's to be read or cited. And I've got an appendix below that gives you tips on how to get work reprinted. Please notice that for 7 and 6, when you are republishing previously published work, you've got to get permission from the first publisher to do that. And you've got to cite the original source as well. If you do that, then you're not stealing and you're not self-plagiarizing. Number 8 is that if you want more citations, tend to publish in journals. It's very clear that articles in journals are generally cited more often than book chapters or conference proceedings. We don't, there's some debate to be had about why that is. I think often articles are just simply more accessible to academics. They're easier to get a hold of than book chapters. And we're lazy. We're not inclined to go walk to the library and check out the book. and articles just pop up more readily on a Google search. There are those kinds of reasons. But in addition, often articles are taken to be the gold standard of publication for many fields. At least in my field, it's generally much harder to publish an article in a very good journal than it is to publish a chapter in a book, even a book that's published with a highly regarded press. And we know that. And so when we're looking for quality work, we often head to the journals as opposed to other things. Again, things vary from field to field. I'm just giving you one example from my field of philosophy. Furthermore, if you're going to publish in journals, then aim for international journals if you want a wider readership. Again, depends on your audience, depends on your goal. But presumably you want, if you want, insofar as you want your work to make a scholarly impact and you want more scholars to engage with it, then you need a wide readership. And so that's going to mean international journals, and roughly those on the Scopus or World of Science lists. They have a wider readership than those that are on the DOET list. And my impression is that those that are listed only on the IBSS list tend to lie in between. The readership is wider than DOHET, but it tends not to be as wide as Scopus or World of Science. Number 10, there's a pecking order in your field, and you've got to learn what it is if you don't know it. But some, there's many scholars will have a kind of intuitive ranking of where journals sit. Some are more highly ranked explicitly. Some are more competitive. Some have a better reputation. Some publish better work than others, or at least judged to. And so some journals are just simply read more often than others. And if you don't have a sense of that, then I would start speaking with senior colleagues, and you might even make a list of the, 15 journals in which you could publish your work, and you might rank them according to stature. When you go to publish and submit work, have that as one factor to consider when doing so. Number 11, publish in journals with high impact factors. I've said twice, I think, that the mere fact a journal has a high impact factor doesn't guarantee that your work will be cited in particular, but, your odds at least go up if the journal's impact factor is high. Some journals promote and others do not. And in particular, the fancy corporate publishers up north, the Taylor and Francis, the Elsevier, Springer, these journals are huge, these presses are huge, and they do work to cross-reference, highlight, index, offer content alerts. Roughly they advertise and they try to market their material. We still might complain about the extent, they might not do it enough, but at least they do it to some degree, whereas other journals do not at all. Number 13 is, I think, pretty important, and that's to choose your keywords strategically. And so I've got 3 pieces of advice here. One is to use as broad a term as you can that still reflects what the research is doing, right? So, there's a tension here in choosing keywords and also titles. I think the same point applies. You want the keywords to, on the face of it, you would want narrow keywords to really reflect what you're doing. But on the other hand, you want to cast your net as widely as you can. And so that pushes in the other direction, that you should use more general terms, less specific ones. And so there's a sweet spot in between that balances these two considerations. And you want to keep that in mind when you're choosing your keywords. The other piece of advice I've got is to use keywords that other people use. And so you might look at the taxonomy used by publishers. So when you submit your article online, often a publisher will make you choose the topic from a computerized list. And so rely on those words from that list. Or look at how academia.edu users have taxonomized their own field. There it's just the academics and the kinds of terms they use as opposed to the publisher. And so that will give you a good clue of what other academics, which terms other academics will use when they're searching for information. The other thing I unfortunately have to share here is that I've been told that American English is favored by the computers as opposed to British or South African English. Sorry about that. Don't shoot the messenger. Number 14, use a short title. Studies show that articles with shorter titles tend to get cited more often. Again, there's debate about why that is. I've got a good theory, I think, which is that if the title is shorter, it's probably broader. The longer the title is, the more information there is, and so probably the narrower the topic, or at least the narrower the topic that's suggested. And so one really strong illustration of this principle is a highly cited journal article with one word. It was titled measles. And so if you're a medical person, you're interested in measles, and you came across a journal article titled measles, well, you would probably read it. And that article has been cited more than 10,000 times. You probably just can't give your article a one-word title or something quite that short and that broad. But again, keep the principle in mind. Try to make your title as short as possible that still accurately reflects the content of your work. 15, publish a book at least once after you've got some kind of presence in the journals. Books are more visible, they're weightier, they're harder to ignore or pass over. And so it's really books and journal articles that get cited the most in many of our fields. Again, depends, it varies. But that's certainly true in humanities and social sciences. 16 is do use open access, but be careful. So, there've just been, literally thousands of purely online journals that have appeared over the past 10 years or so. Generally speaking, they have less stature than print journals that have been around for decades. And so generally, they're not cited as often. And so that's some reason to avoid them. However, what is clearly worth doing sometimes is if you've got a print article, paying to make it also open access. And fees are expensive on this score. They can be, $2,000, $3,000 US dollars or even euros. But often, not always, but often you can negotiate the fees. They won't tell you that, but sometimes they will have the publishers will have special rates for people based in Africa. And other times, if you're able to communicate with a human, they'll just be reasonable. And you wouldn't have known that if you hadn't tried to email and say, is a lower fee possible? So don't be shy about asking to pay something reasonable to make your print article open access. 17, even if you haven't gotten permission to make your work open access as per the previous tip of 16, it might be possible for you to post your print journal article online anyway. And UJ will figure that out for you. So use the UJ repository, send them your off-print, your PDF. And if they think it's legal to post, they will post it online. And they will take responsibility for any copyright infringement or intellectual property dispute or what have you. And so that's a really useful tool. My only gripe with the UJ repository when I was at UJ is that it doesn't show up on Google very well. I think at least when I was there, they did a poor job of making it visible. However, what I could at least do was point, students and colleagues to online work, free off-prints of mine that was accessible online and they could just download with a click. That was nice. Number 18, use the academic networking sites. And the big ones are academia.edu and researchgate.net. They're completely free, takes 2 minutes to sign up. There are millions, hundreds of millions, apparently, on academia.u of members, and they do enhance exposure. There is debate about whether it's legal for you to upload your research to these networking sites, but it's very clear to me that the private accessibility function on ResearchGate is legal. And that's where somebody will request a copy of the article from you, and you send it to that person specifically. That's fair use. There's nothing illegal about that. What the publishers really don't like is you posting things online that where 8 billion people can download. And if there are indeed 168 million academia.edu users, I mean, they've probably got a beef with that too. I've never seen anybody actually sued by a publisher for posting their work on these sites. I think the worst that would probably happen is you would get a nasty gram from a lawyer telling you to take the work down immediately. And so your risk of getting caught, and then there are millions of people doing it, so your risks are low, I think. But if you want to do the legally correct thing, you probably wouldn't upload your work to make them accessible to all members of these networking sites. So there's my, yeah, you get to judge for yourself about what to do. Number 19, easy. After your email signature in an email, include a link to publications, and preferably ones that are downloadable, sorry. 20 out of 34, publish op-eds. So if you write for places like the Mail and Guardian, the Daily Maverick, the Thinker, and especially the Conversation, and this Conversation has a global reach. There are people throughout the world that read articles published in the South African version of the Conversation, and sometimes other outposts of the Conversation, say in France, will reprint certain things published in the South African version. But people who read these can be drawn in to consider your more professional academic publications, and that's going to be particularly true if you include links to them in these articles. Do create a Google Scholar profile. It's free. If people are interested in your work, they then have access to what is hopefully a complete bibliography of your publications. If it's missing any, I've given you advice previously about how to rectify that. Use social media. Facebook, Twitter, and LinkedIn can be of some use in publicizing a new publication. Include links. If you're allowed to include legal copies in some way, do. 23, make sure your UJ webpage says enough about you. Does it reveal enough about your research? Does it enable those who land on the website to access your work in an easy way? That's worth considering. In addition, number 24, you might create your own website. And I have colleagues who do blogs on their research, and they, of course, include links to their academic publications. 25, I've never done this, but I have colleagues who do. They post visual aids. So SlideShare, you can provide a PowerPoint presentation devoted to your work, and it can include links to publications. Office Mix, again, you can provide a video related to your work. 26, don't be shy about emailing publications to specific colleagues. That is perfectly legal, right? There's nothing illegal about writing, specific colleagues out of the blue to say, hey, I know you do work on X, and here's a recent publication of mine, thought it might be of interest. That's perfectly fine. You get permission from some of the publishers to share 50 free electronic off-prints. Do that. Notify colleagues in academic societies or on email lists of recent output. It just can't hurt to spend a few minutes sending emails. 27, once we get to travel again, distribute hard copies of off-prints. And I routinely did this when I was able to go to workshops and conferences. I would bring hard copies of one or two articles, and I'd leave them in the corner of the room, and invariably they would be, scomped up, presumably by postgrads in particular, by the end of my talk or the conference or whatever. It's an easy way to distribute work. Number 28, network. It is really the case that you're more likely to be cited by people who know you. That is just part of the reality of our field, is that goodies tend to come in the wake of interpersonal connection. So get to know colleagues at conferences and workshops, get involved in associations and societies devoted to your field. It will help you not merely get cited more, but also published more. 29, consider co-authoring with scholars who are in different parts of the world or who otherwise have different networks than you've got. 30 published beyond your field. Consider that. Think about whether what you've done could be presented in a way that would be of interest to those in a different field, and particularly one that's indexed differently, that uses different jargon, concepts. 31, it really is okay to cite yourself. Just don't do it gratuitously. Don't, cite yourself when it's appropriate, right? When you reasonably think others would benefit from knowing about your other work because they're interested in a topic, that's okay. Perfectly fine. And my last slide for today, before I see whether you've got questions or comments, is do share your work with postgrads and postdocs. Many of us think it's bad form to make our students purchase our book or whatever it might be. That's, there's some, we might wonder whether that's appropriate, but it's not inappropriate if you give people your work for free. That's okay. And a number of your postgrads or postdocs will indeed become lecturers, and they can extend the life of your work. And then number 3 and 30, the last two, 33 and 34, somewhat different. They're not advice about how to increase your citations, but instead are advice about how to increase the number of citations ascribed to you. So number 33 is use the same name when you publish if you can. Right? If you've got the same name, then it's going to be easier for the computers to ascribe the citations to you. If you're thinking of changing your name upon getting married, for example, you might consider retaining your original name as your nom de plume, your publishing name, your author name. And then 34 is to get an ORCID number. It's becoming standard when publishing in lots of international journals to provide the ORCID number. It's a specific, I think it's 16-digit number that is unique, would be unique to you if you ask for one. And it's becoming now common just to have publications collated under that number. And again, it makes it easier for the computers to find you. It's perfectly free. It doesn't take long, 5 minutes to sign up to get one. And I think that is it for today in terms of the slides. I've got the appendix on how to increase your chances of getting your work reprinted, which you can read at your leisure. And I just now want to see whether you've got any questions or comments. I'm going to stop sharing my screen now.
Many thanks, Thad. And there were a couple of questions in the chat, I think. If those colleagues would like to talk about their questions.
Okay, yeah, I couldn't see the chat while I was doing that, so I'm just going to go through actually. I see a question about the accuracy of Google Scholar citations. Google Scholar hasn't picked up citations, whereas ResearchGate has. That might be true, but the ResearchGate is still, on average, going to have fewer citations than Google Scholar. And that's because ResearchGate is going to count only the documents that have been uploaded to ResearchGate. And that number is just definitely going to be smaller than what Google is able to access. And so I myself, I'd be willing to wager money that your Google Scholar citation count is higher than the ResearchGate one, even if it is the case that Google Scholar has missed some stuff. Yes, I mean, it is frustrating when Google Scholar misses things, but you can top up. You can provide the Google Scholar report, and then you can, add on a paragraph or two to say, look, it's incomplete in the following ways. That's perfectly fine, and hopefully would help you. Self-citation may help with an NRF rating. Yeah, I suppose, but you know what? A good reviewer for the NRF would go sniffing around to see, to scratch the surface of your citation count. I do that when I review applications for the NRF. I do go to Google Scholar and I see what kind, I try to get a rough sense of the percentage of how many of the person's citations are self-citations versus citations by others. That's part of my report. I don't know that other reviewers are as diligent or as thorough as that, but it's some risk. And if you are caught, sort of overly self-citing, it can give you a bad reputation. So I wouldn't, as I say, I wouldn't do it gratuitously. People leaving. Does the university favor the publication of journal articles over peer-reviewed monographs and books? I think generally the best thing for many fields that you can publish is a peer-reviewed monograph, right? A sole-authored or co-authored book is really, for many of our disciplines, the best you can do. So that's fine. However, I do think the university would favor a journal article over an edited book, because the edited book probably isn't going to be viewed as an original or substantive enough contribution relative to the journal article. Does the university consider patents for promotion? Yes. I don't know that there's any numeric, algorithm to calculate how much it matters compared to research articles. I think it probably depends on your field. If you're in engineering, I would think that a patent would count quite a lot. So it is considered. And the NRF also does ask reviewers about patents and other influence on society. That's not the main thing the NRF looks at, but it is one thing. And so it's definitely something to tout if you've got a patent, or even if you've just applied for one. Why doesn't UJ use World of Science for citations? Because of the global university rankings. So there are different ranking systems, and the one that UJ particularly wants to please, I can't remember what it is. I think it's the QS. It tends to favor Scopus accredited journals. So that's the reason. You can get the details, I'm sure, from the DBC research, but that's the overarching reason. But again, if the World of Science works in your favor, that's a highly respected database of journals, certainly comparable in stature globally to Scopus. And I know of some countries that require their academics to publish only in World of Science journals. China, for example, is one. So if it works in your favor, then tout it, play it up. But if you can please the UJ higher-ups by noting a high Scopus index, you should do that too. If there are works not cited using a referencing app, is Google Scholar still able to pick it up? Often, but not always, as we've discussed. You might try a variety of search engines. Somebody's going, self-citation. What if you don't have control of a previous co-author regularly citing an article that you wrote together? Well, it's that person citing you. You're not citing yourself. So I don't think that actually counts as a self-citation. I think you're off the hook. Anything else I can answer? Or comments?
Any other questions? Just put your hand up and we'll give you the floor. There's one more question, I think, or is it someone going? Sorry, it is a question. I beg your pardon. Bilenu, please. Over to you.
Okay, thanks, Prof. Thaddeus. I just want to confirm. I heard you said that the university places more emphasis on journal publications than books. But in the ROU for this, it seems to be the reverse. You get more points for books.
No, I said it places more weight on journal articles than edited books. If you've edited a book, you don't get any subsidy. But I also said that if you've sole authored a book, if you've published a monograph, right, something you've authored, yes, that's the best you can do as a matter of scholarship, and it is the best you can do in terms of the amount of money that it brings into UJ. So there's a difference between a monograph and an anthology or a collection. The monographs count highly in terms of scholarship and the doughhead bucks, but the edited collections count less. So I hope that's more clear.
Okay, any other hands? Yes, Kapil?
Thanks, Prof. I don't know if this is like a fair statement or a controversial statement to say, if the work isn't cited, is it good enough as not having published at all? If no one cites you, it's the same as not having published. And the importance of publishing in high impact factor journals, because I've heard anecdotes where people say, even if it's a high impact factor journal, doesn't mean it will get cited, even if you do publish in a high impact factor. But I don't agree with that, because that's just anecdotal evidence. It's a high impact factor because based on data that it's published, it's cited a higher rate than a low impact factor. And yeah, those two questions, your thoughts? Thanks.
Well, I mean, look, there are studies suggesting that I've read that suggest that what contributes largely to the high impact factor of a journal is not, are a select handful of publications in that journal. They are largely responsible for the high impact factor. I do think, as a matter of statistical odds, right, going in, all things being equal, you'd want to publish in a higher impact factor journal than a lower one. It does increase your odds, but there's no guarantee that yours is going to get more highly cited. I think that's still true. If you publish work that isn't cited at all, it doesn't mean it's a dead publication. It doesn't. I mean, you've discovered something, you've made a contribution. Where you've published it can still matter, and you can still refer to the nature of the argumentation that you provided in your NRF rating app or your application for promotion or what have you. So there are all sorts of ways still to have some sense of pride and accomplishment in getting a publication, even though it isn't cited. This isn't a necessary condition for doing important work or even achieving recognition. So I wouldn't get hung up about citations. The reason I was asked to give this presentation, I think, is that it's just part of the academic game now, and that's particularly true at UJ.
Okay, another hand, Luneta.
Yes, thank you, Prof, for, again, the usual wonderful presentation. I would like you to think around your definition of citation. I think a citation is supposed to be the number of times your work has been referred by others or by yourself compared to the IBS and or where it is published. I think it's how often it has been referenced by other people, yourself, and not where it is published. And according to your definition, you were pushing towards where it is published and not how often it is being referred to by others.
Well, I have to go back to the slide. I think I put a qualifier there. I'm pretty good about that. I put normally.
Okay.
There's normally there to give me an escape hatch for exactly the kind of point you're raising. But I mean, I think what I think is probably true is that if you did publish, if you got cited in something that wasn't academic, and I'm trying to think of a good example, and I'm drawing a blank at the moment. But suppose you are somehow ended up in a reference list of a, I don't know, maybe you're in a bibliography of a I don't know, a self-help book that's published for, not for academics, but for, a general readership. I don't think Google would catch it. It might not. I think Google is really trying to aim for what we would intuitively call an academic source. And sometimes its catchment is broader than that. So I did mention that it will sometimes include a PhD, which doesn't have an ISBN or an ISSN number. But by and large, that's what Scopus, World of Science, and Google are trying to capture.
Okay.
Okay, any other hands? I don't see any. Anything in the chat? I don't see so either. So, wait, one hand. Bilenu again, please.
Thanks, Prof. I just want to clarify. You said sometimes when you have to review for the NRF rating, you go to this Google Scholar and you check for safe citations. I know in Scopus there's a way it's done for you. In Google Scholar, do you have to do it manually, or there's an icon you can use? How do you do it?
Do what?
To
Exactly.
check somebody's safe citation.
Oh, I see. No, there's no quick way to do it, but there will be a list of where the work was cited and who did the citing. And you can often count up. So, I mean, if there aren't hundreds of citations, suppose there are 20, then I can quickly see, I can quickly ascertain the percentage of self-citations. And, when I do it, I don't do it normally to crap on the applicant. If anything, I'm looking for ways to bolster the application. And so if I can say, there are 20 citations and the overwhelming majority are not self-citations, that's the kind of thing I will do. I see some questions about units in the chat. And it doesn't really directly relate to citations. But I mean, how many units does a peer-reviewed monograph get in the university? It ranges from 0 to 10. And I think it depends on roughly how many pages are in the book. And it doesn't matter how small the font is on those pages, I have painfully come to learn. You might have a book with a short number of pages, but quite a long number of words. And it's not going to get as much credit and bring in as much money as a book with lots of pages, but fewer words. But the units don't affect citations at all. So if you, if you were one of 10 co-authors on a paper, let's suppose your unit is 0.1. Whatever citations you get on that paper, counts as a full citation. It's not like it's reduced by 0.1.
Okay, Sue.
Hi, thank you, Prof. Metz, for a very interesting presentation. I've attended a number of them. Always something to learn. I'm busy with an NRF rating review, and one of the questions is about the international stature of the applicant. The number of citations on this application is quite low, and I'm wondering how to gauge international stature, what actually is meant by international stature. How do you work that out? Please, thank you.
Yeah, I mean, I really should spend time thinking about that and give you a list of things you could draw on to gauge international stature, but I would have thought off the top of my head, I mean, beyond citations, it would be publication venues. So are they publishing in international journals as opposed to merely local journals? I would look at the stature of those international journals. Have they, do they have a certain reputation? Have they received a high ranking? Have they appeared with certain kinds of presses that are particularly reputable? I would look at whether the person is receiving invitations to give keynote addresses and is participating in international conferences. I would look at whether the person is receiving more broadly invitations to contribute. So if the person is clearly getting invitations to contribute chapters to edited collections, that's a sign that that they've got some recognition in their discipline. At least in my field, I'd also be looking at whether they are contributing, I don't know how to sum this up, but not necessarily original research, but research that establishes them as an authority on the topic. So for example, people who are selected to write encyclopedia entries are clearly being judged by colleagues as being experts and leading authorities in that area. And you know, an encyclopedia entry isn't supposed to be particularly new or original, groundbreaking. But if you've been selected to do that, that's a sign that you know what you're talking about, or at least somebody thinks you know what you're talking about. So those are some markers. I could probably find, you know, think of more if I had more time, but I hope that gets you going.
Great, that's very helpful. Thank you.
Okay, one more question in the chat.
When should we apply for an NRF rating? Once you've mastered a niche. That's the quick and dirty answer. So once you've published enough to say that you are, you know, you've made a systematic contribution to a well-defined field or subfield, that's the time to apply for a rating. The NRF has a very narrow sense of what counts as a researcher, and the fact of having published or not is not enough to count as a researcher. I have a colleague who published a lot of material, and he was ranked 9th most productive out of more than 120 faculty members. But he didn't get an NRF rating because he couldn't tell a story about how his publications fit together under an umbrella and made a difference to a very, you know, as I say, a well-defined field or subfield. So that's the time. And normally you would need at least 6 to 10 publications on a specific topic in order to have done this. Once you do that, you will get at least a Y or a C rating. At least you should.
Okay, and Luneta again.
Yes, I would like to go back to the point where Sue talked about international scholarship, and I'd like colleagues to take cognizance of the fact that Africa is just as international. If someone is doing work in Namibia, for instance, or in Tanzania, in Ethiopia, that should be regarded as international. We shouldn't just think of Europe being Eurocentric and think international should only be work in UK or working with colleagues in Australia, for instance. I think we should always have that on the back of our minds.
You should, but I was asked from the perspective of the NRF, and from the perspective of the NRF, it does count. But the broader the reach of your scholarship, the more the NRF is going to appreciate your research contributions. So if you've made a difference to scholarship in the rest of the continent, that's good. You're likely then to get probably a B rating. But if you want an A rating, the highest rating, you're going to have to get beyond Africa as well. I'm not saying you should want such a rating or you play the NRF's game, but I was asked from that perspective by Sue, and so I answered from that standpoint.
Okay. Thank you. Another hand, Kapil.
Thanks, Prof. Just on your point of what you raised about the NRF rating. So, is there a good thing that it's not about a random large quantity of publications whereby someone is attaching their name to any field? So, do you think that's a good thing of the NRF rating? I think that's a good thing that you're not just publishing randomly and just putting your name on everything and getting quantity, and then the reviews pick it up to see that you're getting high citations or you're getting a lot of publications, but it's not really contributing to any significant field in any way. So I think that's a good thing. Do you think that's good, Ben?
I can think of counterexamples. So yes, if those were the two alternatives you've given me, then I would pick the one you picked. But I can imagine a third possibility where somebody works in just very different areas of, in my field of philosophy. And if they were, it would be possible to make important contributions to topics that are really quite disparate and unrelated to each other. And I worry that the NRF might be too narrow in excluding that kind of contribution. My advice to that kind of person, if I were giving a spiel about the NRF rating, would be to probably cut away one of the fields and to pitch him or herself as really concentrating on the one, which would be a misrepresentation, really, of what the person has accomplished. But that seems to be the kind of game that the NRF is playing.
Okay, everyone.
Thanks.
No more hands, I see. So can we once again thank Thad very much indeed for a really useful presentation. He's happy for it to be circulated to attendees, but he doesn't like it to be spread beyond attendees, preferably. So we'll get around to that in due course. But thank you very much, Thad.
And thanks very much for the questions. I appreciate the engagement. Have a good day, Peter. Good weekend.
Yeah. Bye, everyone.
Bye.